So we're 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and that should be the start of the live stream. So, we should be up and running there. And the idea of this really is that what we're going to do is we're going to now share with you a bit of a conversation about this model we have here called Education Reimagined. And the idea of this is that within our little mini team, Martha, Mike, and James, we have effectively redesigned what we think the average or the typical classroom model can be. And basically what we're going to do here, we've got a 26-page publication, which you're very welcome to have a good look through. But what we're going to do is we're going to flick straight to here, and I'm going to get Martha to talk a little bit about the notion of this classroom. So let's make it slightly bigger. Okay, so Martha,
hello.
We're live. Fire away.
Well, we're really the future classroom is something we are really proud to.
Do you consider it future classroom, by the way, or do you consider it the current classroom?
I consider it a classroom that is perfectly possible nowadays. It's perfectly feasible. I don't think it's anything futuristic, but I think it's something that very few people are doing at the moment. I think the tendency is much more for a very traditional idea of the classroom still. If you look at the average classroom nowadays and you look at the average classroom, I don't know, 50 years ago, probably the differences wouldn't be major. So yes, it's probably.
I mean, some would argue that's because it works, that it hasn't changed for that reason. I mean, what are your feelings about that?
Yes, you could. I suppose people could make could make that argument. At the same time, I would say it's probably a model that works for some, because how many students go through their school life not really learning as much as they could, not really having that feeling of.
If the question is how many go through not learning as much as they could, I would answer that question as the answer would be either all or very nearly all.
No, and you're probably right.
And I think that's a very pragmatic and practical thing to say, because the reason I think that way is that even those that succeed in current kind of parameters and what we'd consider today to be successful, I mean, they have still taken an externally paced educational experience. The educational experience is still externally paced in the vast majority of cases. So even those that are proven to be successful by qualification outcome or by range of grades or by the confidence that they leave with or whatever, they still have effectively received rather than taken part or been the agent of that education. And I think for me that is the key thing.
Yeah, but maybe before we start discussing we start comparing the traditional system with what we offer. Maybe we should explain a little bit what it is about. Could we start by explaining, maybe, James, where it comes from, where the idea of this classroom, where does it come from?
Well, it comes from the classroom. I mean, it in the sense that what happened with me was that I was probably what would be considered to be a pretty traditional teacher a few years ago, in the sense that I was very much in control of the rhythm and the order of what happened and the activities that were taking place in the classroom. But I equally was finding that it was only partially effective in a range of situations, even with students that had everything that they needed to be successful. I found it was a limited experience, and I think I was as solid as the next person in the classroom. I would think I was a pretty good explainer of things. I was a pretty good presenter. I was a pretty good preparer of materials. I was a pretty good marker. All these kind of things that go into it. But basically, what happened was that I started recording my teaching. That was the first thing. And my teaching through very simplistic video tutorials then became available for students to remediate knowledge that they hadn't mastered, to revise before exams, to repeat, but also for students to go ahead and to learn in advance of what was coming up. And ultimately what came out of that was that if you take the structural element of the teacher being at the front and explaining things to all the students in one go, even if you've got different setting or whatever, then it leaves a much more flexible classroom experience for students to direct their own learning, but most importantly, to pace their own learning to a rhythm that suits them and to master concepts as they go along, rather than having a go at something, not mastering it, and then moving on. That was some of the fundamental things that I found were flawed.
Okay, and from here we then go on to basically taking these ideas, taking these things on board, then we develop a whole structure, a whole structure that can work in the classroom.
And I think it's important to remember this took probably 4 to 5 years to evolve. So this is not something that just happened overnight. But the first thing, I've already explained the first thing, but the knock-on effect was that I didn't need to be at the front of the classroom anymore. That my job had ended from that perspective, because the teaching that I was doing at the front of the classroom was now all dealt with, and students in what would considered for many to be a much more a real backhanded compliment. Students would say to me lines like they preferred me on YouTube than in the classroom as a teacher. Now that was an interesting thing to hear. So effectively what happened, I'll show it in the image here. Effectively what happened was that we moved to a zoned classroom. So each of the zones in this classroom, and you can see how they're highlighted there. The first zone is by that little Wi-Fi red signal there. What we'd call this little signal here is what we call the terminal zone. So effectively what students do there is they choose to go there when they need to take a tutorial, or they need to do an online quiz, or they need to do some internet research or something like that. They never ever go there to do things like typing coursework or typing material. And then other sort of typical classroom behaviours, such as mastering worksheets, doing past paper questions, marking things, peer marking, textbook research, that was all done in this sort of green, what we call the quiet study area over here. And what we did was that we made all the resources available on the shelves for the entire course, so a student could make progress with those whenever they needed to, according to their targets. And we also have this area here, which is kind of like the communal social area. This is what we call the play space. And the idea of this space is that students go there to build things, to debate things, to construct things, to manipulate things with their hands, to make things in relation to the skills and the content they're looking to improve on. And finally, this is in many ways the most traditional element of the classroom. And this is what we call a small group teaching space. Now, if we've got a student who's stuck on, topic 9, then of course what we do here is, look, what we've got on the board here is kind of levers. Let's say topic 9 was levers, and I've got student 8 is stuck on topic 9. Well, I would work specifically with student 8 on topic 9, rather than at some point going over levers with everybody, because the tutorials were already doing that job. And the only thing I'd add at this point, 2 points actually. One is we very specifically put a very traditional whiteboard. I actually was tempted to put a blackboard in there, because you don't need anything else to teach.
No. In
that delivery sense, you don't need an interactive whiteboard. You need one individual explaining something to one or two others. That's all you need, and a whiteboard does that job brilliantly. A bit of a money-saving possibility there. And the second point I would make, and perhaps we can explore this a bit more, but the other point is that every student that chooses their own direction around this classroom, it's essential that they have razor-sharp targets, and that all the targets target mastery, never, ever anything else.
And what sort of equipment do you consider essential in the future classroom?
Tables, chairs, pens, pencils, the resources that students need to succeed, a lot of paper-based resources. And in terms of IT, I would say the most fundamental and basic IT device possible. We don't need any snazzy Apple this or that. There's no comment on Apple. I like their products, but they're expensive. You literally need a screen, and you need Wi-Fi or Ethernet cabled internet. And of course, the other resource you need is you need a service that provides you the tutorials, the online quizzing, the tracking, the analytics, the test setting online. And of course, that's where we do our work. So in spite of me not wanting to do a sales pitch here, that of course, if you don't have that centerpiece, you can't really do the other bits, because the teacher still has to teach.
And what would you say to those people who say, who may think, well, what is the point of a teacher being there if the students are doing the learning online? What's that going to mean for the teaching profession?
Well, yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, we get asked and very often accused of that question, quite regularly actually. So I would say that our vision of that is that we just see the role of the teacher changing. We think it's absolutely fundamentally important the specialism of the adult, the teacher in this classroom is even more important than in traditional. But we want to remove, in many ways, the more mechanistic behaviours of teaching, planning for delivering, and rote learning, marking. We think that all of that can be automated. And what that does, of course, it allows the teacher's time to be entirely reserved for interaction with students. Now, that interaction can take many different forms. It can take the form of a one-to-one to target set. It can take the form of a coaching conversation. It can take the form of a cajoling, supportive conversation. It can take the form of, why not try this resource instead of that one? It can also be a disciplinary conversation, although that becomes quite rare in this classroom. And what we'd like people really to realize is that you might notice in in the teaching profession now, it's actually the concept of the master teacher does not exist in our society, certainly within the classroom. What most teachers need to do, they have a teaching career. It happened exactly like this with me. Other people fast track, take longer, whatever. You have a teaching career. You maybe do that 3, 4, 5 years, whatever. And then effectively what you have to do if you want to earn the bigger money, or you want to go further in the professional, you want to go, in inverted commas, higher, the only realistic way of doing that is to move into some kind of managerial role. And we fundamentally reject that concept. We want to create the concept of the master teacher, because the teacher we're talking about in this classroom is a deeply skilled individual.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point, because it is true that, yes, in the teaching profession, as you become more experienced, as you become a better teacher, then you start spending less time in the classroom.
Perverse.
Exactly. So the teaching is often, or the bulk of the teacher is often left probably to more inexperienced teachers, while the teachers with the most experience and with that could be very useful in order to pass on that knowledge are busy with managerial duties. That's interesting. And also from the point of view of the students, what skills, what different skills do you think a student would develop in this type of classroom to a traditional classroom? What do you think?
I would say the kind of the umbrella skill is what I would refer to as autodidactism. And that is the fact that they effectively teach themselves, and they learn the skill of learning within this classroom. So nobody's going to force them to do anything in this classroom. No, some people might freak out at that sort of idea. But in this classroom, the only imperative is to meet those mastery targets on time. Generally speaking, what you find is that students meet them well beyond that time frame, and very often go on, or if they don't, they take longer because there's a specific reason to do that, such as a lack of mastery, even though they've given it everything. But the other thing I'd say is that it definitely self-pacing, self-direction, time management, ownership. They become much better readers. I know that sounds kind of nuanced point, but they become much better at extracting meaning from written documentation. They become much better note takers, because the real onus of learning the fundamentals here is from a tutorial which is taught by the master teacher, the expert. So they become much more effective at note taking. But perhaps interestingly as well, they become themselves teachers. Because, of course, what happens very, very frequently in this classroom is you have people learning at different rates. Now, if student A has really nailed down and mastered concept B, but student C is really struggling in that, then it's very predictable that student A is going to work with student C on this one, and then sometime later it might be the other way around. So the idea of teaching one another also becomes of or what we often call the coaching model, becomes of paramount importance. And I would have just add to that, and it's a really interesting quote. I heard Sal Khan say recently, Sal Khan at the Khan Academy, he said his ambition for his own children, who at the time was starting I think what would be called elementary school in the US, his ambition for his children in the classroom was not to be brilliant students, but brilliant teachers. And I thought that was a very interesting point, and this brings that model out. So yeah, I would say those would be very different to the current model, where we tend to see a consumption of what the teacher is providing in the classroom. Here, the provision is there because all the resources are there, but the student has to engage with those actively and in their own ownership. And if they don't do that, it will be very obvious within seconds.
Yeah, I agree with you. It is a much more active model than the one that currently happens in most classrooms. And also, probably as a consequence, I also see it as a model that's much more suited to the modern life and to the current professional life,
I agree.
because these students who are nowadays in our class, the field of work is going to be completely, that they will have to still learn a lot of things, even if they go on to do a degree and they go into university. It doesn't matter. Once they're out of university, they will still have to learn lots of things that they haven't learned, and probably very often they will have to teach themselves, because I think things like technology and most fields, they develop at such a vast speed that you're not going to find a course where a teacher will come and explain things to you. And I think it's also interesting
or if
that
you do find the teachers, probably online.
Interestingly. Yes, exactly. And I think also the other thing is that we often sometimes teachers tend to also see students as consumers and as they won't be interested, they won't do it. But if we think about it, how many of our students have learned to do things through YouTube, through YouTube tutorials? They are the first ones to go and learn things that if they're interested in something, they will go and do it. So we just need to get that interest in them, and that's probably another thing that the coach needs. Another one of the roles of the coach is get students enthused and get students wanting to learn, and then the rest will look after itself, really.
One of the privileges of this model, as opposed to the one I used to work in, which was let's call it the delivery model loosely, or the transmission classroom model. One of the great privileges of this one is that you get to know your students extremely well. You spend way more time talking to them and, importantly, listening to them. I mean, you spend almost no time at all talking at them. I mean, that is gone. And those people, and I was one of them, those people that really valued that kind of delivering from the front, sadly, that is going to disappear. I mean, I'm sorry, I know people may be disappointed by that, but that is happening, and that is going to happen. It was hard for me to accept that, because I was a bit of a show-off. I liked to be at the front of the classroom. I liked to be up there teaching. I was on my kind of little ego stage, kind of doing my thing as I, with my teacher badge on. And but this model doesn't require that, and you have to develop it. It's a much more nuanced and subtle skill. The skill of saying to a group of people, be quiet, sit still and listen to me, is a very basic skill. The skill of saying to an individual, this is the resource you need to succeed, and I believe in you fundamentally, that's a much higher level of skill, because the communication is so much more subtle. It has to be so much more persuasive. It has to be so much more information-based and rich. And I would argue these are the true examples of what it means to be a true educator, not just follow the rhythm that I set for you and do what I say. So yeah, I mean, I personally much more enjoy this model than I did the previous one. And I'm very, it's something that I would really endorse for people. I sometimes hear people kind of fearful of it because they've got so much pressure on, that they think, well, I couldn't possibly make a change as big as that, because the risk to my exam results and my outcomes are so significant that it would be almost impossible to achieve that. And I recognize that, and that's why people need like the vision that we're providing through this. But the other thing is they need the reassurance that you can start small. You remember I said before, it took me 5 years to get to this point. It's not something that happened overnight. And it might be that you play with this model in your workshop, kind of, in the extra learning you do, if you like. The what you might call the alternative educational stuff that you do, or you might choose a single unit or topic to roll this out with, or you might do it with your revision model. You might do it this way, and I would argue that it can be really effective.
And once this model is implemented, would every lesson be exactly the same way?
No, we call this the stock lesson. So, I guess my old stock lesson was starter activity, PowerPoint, worksheet, past paper question, plenary, get them out. That was my old stock lesson. 6 times out of 10, we'd do stuff like that. And we're saying 6 times out of 10, you would have the classroom like this. But of course, you still need that 4, or it might be for someone else 5, or even 6 out of 10. This might just be the 4 out of 10 lessons. It's up to the individual. But you need that other lesson, because you need to do things together for the communal experience. You also need to do things together because you might have a responsibility to do a data extraction, I don't know, a timed essay, say. You might want to do a group work activity, and therefore you collapse the classroom in that setting to this. You may very much in our subject, you may want to do a practical activity and people do that together. You know, this classroom would not work with dangerous activities. If we had a corner in this classroom which was, I don't know, loading a rifle, it wouldn't work because that needs supervision, or trampolining or javelin throwing. It has to be supervised and it has to be didactically controlled. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about working with a piece of paper
and a pen.
And a pen. You know, it's not quite as
pencils can be dangerous sometimes. I've seen it happen.
Yeah, those electronic pencil sharpeners you've got to be a little bit careful with as well. I've had a couple of eraser burns in my time. But I would say 6 out of 10.
It's that and paper cuts, really.
Paper cuts. Yeah. But I would say as well, the other thing that might be worth thinking about from a structural perspective as well is that sometimes we get criticised for this model because it's like, well, you know, some students will never get to the end of the course. The target setting deals with that. Let's say you have fortnightly targets. Those targets are a minimum standard for the students to achieve, and they not only get the students ready in terms of the content, but they are mastering the skills and the content by those points as a minimum, many beyond that point. So it's really a myth to say that this type of classroom does not allow for people to complete the whole course. Not only do they complete it, but they master the whole course. Now, theoretically, it is possible an individual, you know, they may have a year or 2 years of a level, and for whatever reason they don't quite get there in that 2 years, and they have to repeat and do a third year. I've never seen it happen yet in this classroom model, but it's theoretically possible, and that can happen. But that can't be a criticism against the current model, because countless students do third A-level years, for example, and this model, you know, I guess at least potentially has that same safeguard in place.
But also, I mean, that's a good point. But I suppose in the current model, or I suppose generally, the having to do, for example, an A-level in 3 years rather than 2, I suppose it's only seen as a failure in a way, because someone arbitrarily has decided that has to be done in 2 years, and if it takes you a bit longer, then that's not right. And if you know, it's just, you know, who decided that it was going to take 2 years? Who decided what goes into a course in 2 years? It's as we know, everyone learns in a different way, and everyone, you know, the different ways, different speeds, and you know, and sometimes there are things that before you start learning new things, you need, you know, there are things that you need to remediate, so you need to go backwards, and you need to look at things that will allow you to go forwards. Let's take an A level or a BTEC level 3 or a GCSE, or choose whatever qualification you want. It's absolutely possible in this model that if a student has not fundamentally mastered a concept from the level before, they can go, that is now important because it's holding them back going forward, they can go back and do that in this model. In the traditional model, it doesn't really work very well. In this model, it's absolutely plausible that the student goes forward by first going back to fill that gap in that mastery, and then moves forward. And we see mastery as really important, because if you have mastery deficits in the skills that you have, at some point in the future, they're gonna trip you up. Yeah, and this notion of mastery deficit, that's what, you know, it really takes us to our redefinition of success, to what you know, we've worked out that is essential in order to have academic success.
Well, I don't know if I would choose the word academic success. I've always struggled with that word. I've never truly understood what that word meant.
No,
I don't think so. I mean, maybe you can explain to me, but I don't.
Well, I suppose academic, like study success, rather than success in life, or success in, I don't know, playing chess or cards.
Well,
or, you know,
that seems a perfectly...
just to differentiate it from success in any other ways. You might not have academic success, but actually be very successful in life doing something that is manual. I don't know.
Would you not also recognise, though, that the notion of academia or academic success has become almost politicised with in a way, because it's seen by so many people to be a type of success so much superior
Oh no, I
to
don't.
other forms of success. Like, so to be academically, I hate this word, but gifted,
Yeah.
is seen to be so much more important than. I mean, you can almost put a hierarchy in there. Academic seems to be number one. Music's up there. Even if you take the idea of let's accept that talents are real for a moment. If you have a kind of musical capacity, even that has a hierarchy above something like singing, even though they're from the same genre. And I find that really interesting. And then you know, further down, you've got the idea of movement, sport. These are much lower, when really.
I agree with you. But being I don't know. Yes, having academic success in the sense of having a very good degree and a master's and a PhD. That I don't think that's necessarily more. That's necessarily better than doing something else. We to me
you don't feel that. I don't feel that
the
either.
most
But I think
important
it's fair
thing is
to
that
say,
you are happy in what you're doing. If if it's and the thing is, there are so many miserable people who've got really high level of studies that I think the older I get, the more the more I see that But at the same time, I think having, let's call it school success, being successful at school, I think that is important in the sense that then it gives you choices, and
totally
you
agree.
might want to go
And
on
confidence.
and get a PhD,
And
or you might
identity.
want to go and work in whatever you want.
Yeah.
But I think having that backing of, look, I've got my studies, and that sets you off in a good way for the rest of your life, really. So
No, I agree. I agree. Well, I mean, it ultimately comes down to a requirement for people to be productive within our society and to contribute in a communal and economic sense. And I totally agree with you. For me, I mentioned two things there about let's call it school or institutionalized success. I totally agree. I think it's also very important for an individual's self-perception, confidence, self-identity. And there are a lot of systems within education that do that well, and there are other systems that do that pretty poorly. And it kind of brings us to this point of what we consider success to be, or how success can be defined. And what we tried to do with this model, and it actually really helped us to fundamentally understand our own classroom model too, is we tried to look at the variables that led to success. And effectively, we identified these four variables. A huge plethora and diversity of experiences and behaviours can be fitted into these, but I'll kind of go through them slowly. So this sort of notion of school success, or let's call it academic success, or it's a very personal thing. It's a very momentary thing. It's experienced in a moment, not always. So someone can be successful in one moment and completely unsuccessful in the next, whoever they are. But we argue that it's a product of familial involvement. That's the FI part that we've got here, familial involvement. And familial involvement is all that stuff of stability and love and parenting and modelling. But it's also a technical involvement of the parents in the educational cycle. And we think at the moment schools do that particularly poorly, that parents are very often dislocated.
Especially in secondary. Once students
and
get
I
to
think
secondary
increasingly
school.
in primary as well.
Probably increasingly, but I think traditionally the having the parent helper and that sort of thing is a very, very
that's
true.
true.
And having the parents go and pick up the children at the school gate, and they pick them up from the teacher,
There's more
especially the
conversation.
infant. Exactly, you can
You're
have
probably aware of success and problems much earlier than
yes,
than
exactly.
you would be
And then
in
at secondary, there's that, as you said, there's almost a complete dislocation of what's going on.
Once or twice a year you get a report. Once or twice a year you get a parents' evening appointment for 5 or 10 minutes.
And it is true that if you've got, if your child explains to you how things are going and and what's going on, then that's probably fine. But also there are lots of children and teenagers who get to that age where they don't really explain that much.
No.
So yeah, it is.
I agree. So anyway, so we think familial involvement, both in terms of the stability, love, modelling aspect of being at home, and also practical things like access to literature and good conversations and good nutrition and all good sleep and all those sort of things, very, very important. But we also think behaviours, the B, is very, very important. Behaviour, when we talk about behaviours, we're not talking about behaving oneself in a disciplinary sort of sense. We're saying this is that a learning behaviour is any behaviour which directly leads to the acquisition of knowledge, skills, and also of new behaviours that represent the learning that was desired. So classic examples of that are perseverance, effort, time spent studying, which I'll come to in a second. There are also things such as note-taking skills. They're just simple things. They're also the skill of, they're also the behaviour of seeing a challenging question, say, or challenge, and not giving up in that moment because you assume you can't do it. So there's all kind of psychological and self-perception type issues, aspects of that as well. The R is resources. Resources are those things that lead to intuition of a concept. Okay, so
what sort of things would you group into the resources?
Okay, so I mean, it can be very different in different environments. But first of all, let's take teaching as a resource. Every student has the right to teaching. Now, in the traditional model, as we've already talked a little bit about, the traditional way is that they receive teaching, I don't know, on a Tuesday, 11 o'clock in the morning on numeracy for an hour or something like that. But when that hour is over, that experience is finished. So we try to increase the access to that resource by providing the same quality of teaching, or maybe even providing the better teaching, the best in the world even, and making it available whenever the student needs it. I'd also take a very practical thing like, let's take a worksheet as an example. Very often worksheets, they'll be for repetition of a skill, or they'll be for kind of retrieval of information from a very superficial encoding in the long-term memory. And what we think worksheets should be for is to develop a grasping intuition of knowledge, particularly of a skill. So that is a resource which we really, really highly value. Something like repetitive practice of a problem set in maths or balancing up equations in organic chemistry, I can't think of better examples. We think they should be automated so that the data from those rote learning experiences is immediately available to those taking them and those interested in feeding back. Valuable time is two things, the VT at the end. Valuable time is it's two things. Let me state clearly. Valuable time is valuable time spent with a teacher or coach. So we do not include one-pace-fits-all lessons as valuable time, but something like a one-to-one where you're target setting, you're discussing things, you're remedying problems, and you're gap filling, for want of a better phrase. That's very valuable time.
Okay, so it's valuable time with someone.
And we would say to course managers, timetablers, senior leaders in the educational sector, we would say utterly neglect the idea of teacher to student ratio. Doesn't matter. What matters is student to valuable time with a teacher ratio. So I know I'm being provocative deliberately. Utterly neglect student to teacher ratio. I mean, it could be carnage, but I'm trying to make the point that the real thing of the value is valuable time with the teacher. And the other aspect of VT, or valuable time, that we value very, very, very highly is any time spent in deep concentration by the learner. So we need experiences where deep concentration are encouraged and caused. And the other thing is we need interaction between the lead, the coach, the facilitator, the teacher, the master, the role model, whatever, and the student. But we have to say that there's this MD part as well, mastery deficit. I've touched on it already. You can have brilliant family, magnificent learning behaviours, brilliant access to resources. You can spend a lot of time in concentration. But if you come to a part of algebra that requires an intuition of how to multiply negative numbers, and you haven't mastered how to multiply negative numbers, you cannot do that thing.
And how do you suggest you remedy what things that you think a student can do to remedy that?
Well, the remedial model first of all assumes that mastery deficits have been built up. Of course, the first thing we have to do, we have to be pragmatic and say, how do we go back and fill gaps in mastery skills? But the first thing we have to do is we have to promote a model which is built on mastery. So as few mastery gaps will be built up as possible as the student develops through their school, career and experience. But the other thing is we should have a system which is agile enough that the thing of importance is not delivering courses and content and getting through a course and a qualification, but is getting the exact resource which is most relevant to the individual at exactly that moment. And I tell you now, it's absolutely possible to achieve that level of agility. I know sometimes people don't always believe me when I say that, but it's absolutely possible to achieve that. I guarantee people who listen to this and see this little image drifting about on the screen, I guarantee to you that I can't guarantee that all of your students will get an A star, or what's the new GCSE, a 9, is it?
Yeah.
I can't guarantee that, but what I can absolutely fundamentally guarantee to them is that every single student they work with can master topic 1, and they can master topic 2, and they can master topic 3, but they need a variable seat time, presentation, resource, experience in order to get to that level of mastery. And currently our system does not address these ideas.
No, that's yes, that's a fact.
Yeah, and again, we don't present this model to people because we think it's perfect. I'll come back to the classroom image here. We expect this classroom to change. We think in 12 months' time this classroom will be different because it's not perfect.
Are you starting to have any ideas
Yes.
on how? Yes, any.
Yeah, numerous. Some of them very basic and simple. Some of them to do with the experience of educational coaching and how teachers interact with students, the actual behaviour of that interaction, becoming more and more interested in. I think a lot of the...
Yeah, sorry, I
Sorry,
was just going to say, I mean, I trained not that long ago, and if I think about it, there's nothing in teacher training that prepares you for coaching. There's lots of things about delivering and doing data and mark books, but it's mainly about delivery of content, and of course this requires some very different skill set to that in the average teacher training, really.
Well, let me be blunt. The people who are providing the teacher training for teachers who are going to be teaching in the next 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 years are wrong. The courses they are providing are wrong. The fundamental skills that they are developing with teachers are wrong. That's not to say they're useless, but the base skills that they're developing in the teaching profession are going to completely undermine the capacity of those colleagues to perform in a role which is going to be relevant, required and valued by learners in a modern world. So we have to fundamentally review how teachers are developed. But of course, the first thing we need to do is we need to provide the vision of what that stock classroom is before that. But anyway, to come back to my point, I'm really interested in the coaching between that experience. I'll just give you a simple example of this, and I'm nowhere near this, so please don't think that I'm aspiring, please don't think that I'm claiming something I can already do. I'm very interested in the idea that in the one-to-one conversation that the teacher has with the student or the coach has with the student, I'm very interested in the idea of never instructing anything, that you only guide through questions, actually almost not giving advice. The idea that I mean, imagine the scene. A student would come to a teacher and say, "Miss Martha James, whatever, I'm stuck on this. Please, can you tell me what to do?" Or some words to that degree. Imagine that situation saying, "No, I won't tell you what to do, but here's a resource that will help you succeed. And I'm going to ask you some questions that's going to really get to the bottom of what the issue is." And of course, if you ask a question of somebody to reveal the insight, it's very different to forcing that insight into someone by teaching them it. So on that basis, let me go back to the page. On that basis, I'm kind of intrigued by this part of the small group teaching part of the model here, because actually, my longer term aspiration is not to need that. Not to need that at all. There's other things such as there's more technological, I suppose, but we've got the idea of the online tutorial. I kind of let's say that we're in a science lesson and I don't know, we're learning about fluid dynamics or something like that, and a great way of emphasizing that would be to use a Venturi meter to explain Bernoulli's principle or something like this. Well, it's probably too expensive for a school to be able to produce the experiment in which that stuff would work, the fans and the Venturi meter and the airflow and the measurement, but we could do it in a virtual model. We could make that really cost effective. We could set that experiment up so it was a very high-performing university-level experiment, and the individual could operate that experiment through that virtual world. So I'm interested in that, not because it's snazzy and cool and modern.
Well, I mean, nowadays
because it gets resources to where they're needed. It gets resources to where they're needed, and it obliterates the idea of access or limited access. It democratizes the learning process because it means that more resources are available to more people more of the time, or even all people.
And I suppose nowadays in schools with budget cuts, having access to certain equipment and to certain things will get.
Well, the funding
trickier.
thing's an interesting point, and I only throw this in there because it just happens to be a reality. The classroom we're talking about here is incredibly cheap. Incredibly cheap. First of all, it's incredibly cheap because it requires much less bureaucratic and administrative structures behind it.
In what way? What do you mean?
Take something like... first of all, we've got an individual classroom here, so I'm jumping forward some stages to talk about the idea that these classrooms could be numerous adults and teachers to much bigger groups, that you could have much more open spaces, that you could have lots of individuals learning within a particular zone and moving in between areas as required. But it also obliterates the idea of things like the timetable, the rigid structure of time. That's not to say that we won't all roughly have lunch between midday and 1:30 in the day. So that's when people get hungry. So it's kind of normal. But this idea that we learn maths Monday between 9 and 10, Thursday between 1 and 2, Friday between 11 and 12, that idea will be gone. So all of that administrative and bureaucratic structure outside of the classroom experience itself will be gone. The other thing, of course, is that this classroom is extremely cheap in terms of its resources. So I'll give you one simple example. The technological side of this, even though it's a technological solution, all we're using is Wi-Fi and a basic device which you probably could pick up for less than 25 quid. And you don't even need one of those per student. In fact, we don't want students on screen time all the time.
No.
So you're talking about a very cheap resource. You're talking about removing things like interactive whiteboards. You're talking about a classroom model here, which we anticipate would be up to 25% cheaper. And we don't think it should be cheaper. We just think that more of those resources should go towards the master teacher. And I come back to that point I made before, which is that the master teacher currently doesn't exist because people have to sideline into management and then earn their 60 grand, 80 grand, 120 grand at executive principal level that way. And what we're saying is, in this way, the master teacher can be the doctor, the lawyer of the classroom, effectively.
And I suppose a system like this could also marry very well into the idea that is developing more and more of getting rid to a way of the different subjects, having not learning by subject, but more learning by project, by this is what we're doing, or desire, but this is what we're doing, and in order to do that we need to learn this and this and that, and it doesn't matter. So you could, I suppose, conceivably you could have a relatively large group and then have teachers there who've got their different specialisms, and that would really enable.
And by the way, one of those specialisms, I will address that point, but one of those specialisms may not be subject knowledge. A brilliant teacher might not have great subject knowledge. A brilliant teacher might be that person who can say the perfect words while looking a young person in the eye to make them believe. Now that would be I mean, I'm being somewhat of an ideologue here, but that would be a magnificent teacher, as long as working next to them would be a brilliant professor type, knowledgeable subject content type individual. I think we all know, right, that the very many professor types ain't that good at interacting, you know. So in this model, the other thing is CPD. You know, how many? I had a background in PE, so we fairly often taught in teams. Very often on the field together, wet weather lessons where everyone's crowded into the gym. You very often teach in front of other colleagues and you play to your own strengths in the presence of that other teacher. But in this model, by definition, teachers teach in teams, 2-3 teachers within a learning space, more in the future, and therefore people can play to their strengths. They can model based on one another. You can have the master teacher and the junior teacher and you have that notion of the apprenticeship through teaching as well, and that's absolutely possible within this model. And I know people think I'm idealistic with this. I don't care. It's
No, but
absolutely achievable if we imagine it.
And also, in order to move things forward, you have to be idealistic. You have to have ideas that currently might look possibly difficult to achieve. But if you just constrain yourself to what people do now or slightly different, nothing's going to really change significantly.
Well, I think there's a great truth in what I've heard someone I respect a very great deal say. I'll mention who it is. Not everyone will agree with respecting this person, but a guy called Conor McGregor, who's an MMA fighter, and I know some of that won't be to everyone's taste, but is, in my opinion, he's one of the best athletes I've ever. He probably is the best athlete I've ever seen move, and I respect him a great deal for that, and I respect him a great deal for his mentality. And one of the things that I always keep in my mind is I imagine it. Whatever I imagine, I can bring into reality. All I have to do is visualize it hard enough, strong enough, and with enough conviction, and then I bring it into reality. And I think it's absolutely achievable. Ideology is also a significant part of that, because you have to visualize and bring into reality something which has an ideological conviction and certainty to it. And assuming that's the case, I see no barrier that is that can't be overcome in that sense. So again, people might think that I'm a crazy person, but it's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So
good.
Let's kind of wrap this up. I mean, I put in a couple of aspects of the publication here. I hope people will put descriptors. We'll put descriptors into the description as well. And I'm just gonna click on this. I think it'd be nice for people to see this. Let me just see if I can make it a little bit bigger for you. This is an example of our target setting sheet. Let me just make it a little bit. So all students work to these targets.
This is what a student would be armed with.
They would be armed with
in
this
order to move around the classroom. Yeah,
they don't want to lose this. I mean, and I'd say about this is really important. There's quite a few. This would be like 2 weeks worth of targets on like a level 3 course. This is like a biomechanics part of an A level. If a student doesn't meet these targets in 2 weeks, first of all, you'll know it in advance, because you'll know from the target setting meeting. You'll know within half an hour if they're on it. You know, if they're really focusing down. That's not to say that nobody can have a 5-minute little ease or break or go to talk, whatever course, but you'll know it's not happening, because the data will not be coming back into you. And the other thing is, if they get to 2 weeks in and they haven't achieved these targets, first, you'll already know it, remember that, but we consider that to be choosing not to learn. And I can't say this strong enough. That is the most fundamental negative behavior in our classroom, choosing not to learn. And remember, notice it's mastering. I mean, feel free to pause and read these targets if you're watching this on demand. But yeah, if they get to 2 weeks in, or it might be a week in some courses, some courses where they see their students more often, like maths, say, and GCSE or something like that. If they don't meet those targets, then we consider that to be choosing not to learn, and there's nothing more serious. I mean, I guess theoretically, if someone stabs someone in the back with what's one of those things, a protractor, then I guess that would be more serious in one sense. But the first time that happened, you'd be talking about parents coming in, you'd be talking about really serious repercussions for that individual. Because what are they there for? They're there as a learner. So if they're choosing not to learn,
they're breaking the contract, isn't it?
It's a complete break of contract. And the students, by the way, really respect that idea. What happens with the students is that they become more involved in the target setting. Because if they don't feel it's realistic for them, or they've got things in the way that are going to stop that, or that they know I've got 2 weeks of performing every night in the local concert, that kind of performer type, they say to you, look, can we just draw back on the targets this week because I've got this other, and you just negotiate that with people. And that's really nice. Or you might have an A-level student who's doing A-level art in their portfolios, you just manage that with the student. And of course, as you're leading up to that, you've already spoken about it, and you've pushed ahead leading up to that, so that the downtime can be achieved when it's needed. It's a much more agile model.
Yes.
But yeah, it's kind of interesting when all your students are working at different points in content skills. And
but I suppose within that, there are certain deadlines that everyone
100%.
needs to have.
we still have checkpoints, we still have timed tests, and these are published at the start of the year. I'm not gonna. I'll put a link to that in the description because it's just gonna. It'll take me a bit of fumbling around before I actually find the example of that. But yeah, and so we have set points that students are we're gonna have data extraction. That was my tummy. We have data extraction. If that came through the microphone, not sure the gain's high enough. We have data extraction points where students absolutely must be at a certain level by then. And very often we find on those data extraction points, it's actually students going back to stuff that they've gone past, that they're now going to be measured on and tested on. And we're starting to introduce a system now where even the testing is more agile. I actually wonder what that would do long term with something like external exams. Now we're not quite at that stage, but this idea of all students taking their Spanish exam on a Tuesday in June for some reason, I think that idea is going to dissolve. Anyway, I've got one question for you because I think it's kind of an interesting one to ask you. I want you to answer this for me, and you might only be able to partially answer it. I don't know. Look, you're a languages teacher, right? What is the restriction in a model like this one of students actually studying different languages within the one classroom?
I suppose the only restriction I can see here it's probably in the practical area. Just because, of course, if you're going to in languages, I suppose typically the quiet study area would be exam practice. That could be reading, listening through headphones, writing, etc. The doing, the more sort of hands-on doing area, that would typically, I suppose, be more devoted to the speaking practice. Of course, in that case, you would always need at least one other person to practice that particular skill with you, and of course, it needs to be
or a very, very smart system.
Or a very smart system, yes. But then then you would probably be relying on then more computers, for example. I don't know. That's the only limitation I personally see, and that shouldn't be, I suppose as long as you've got more than three, more than two people studying the same language, that would probably be feasible.
Where it gets interesting for me in the languages model, and I've only a very small amount of languages teaching, so I'm in no way an expert on this, but where it becomes interesting for me is that one of the very typical models at the moment is you have the teacher and you have the assistant teacher.
Sometimes if you can, and if the budget stretches
where budget allows, where practicalities allow, of course. So one of the things I think it's interesting, it's based on that same premise. I mean, I guess what happens in a lot of classrooms at the moment is the conversational stuff with the assistant is in a different room, or in the corridor, or in the office, or in whatever space. Whereas in this classroom, it's very much the same space, and the assistant, come back to what I said before, you may very well have the master teacher and the junior teachers. And I only mean junior in terms of experience, stage of career, progression, all those sorts of things. I mean, I think it's very possible that you allow the conversational individual to really play to that strength, while, let's say, the master teacher or the really organised one is the one who's doing the checking and keeping people on track and all of those sorts of things.
Yeah, I mean, going back to your question of what would be the limitations, I mean, the other thing, I suppose, is that, as you said, this would be your stock lesson in like maybe 6 out of 10 lessons. Of course, in the other lessons where you do, where you bring everyone together, doing an activity that is at the same time French, German, and Spanish, that would probably be the biggest limitation.
But let's say there's a head of MFL listening to this, and they've got A-level programs, and they've got 6 doing German, 2 doing French, 3 doing Spanish. I'm just making the numbers up. Numbers at A-level in languages in some places are not so high.
No.
Isn't it the case that, let's say they're doing 5 lessons a week or whatever, they're doing 5 sessions a week, say. Isn't it therefore the case that 3 of those 5 could actually be together in this model, and it would be the other 2 or the other 3 or the other 1, or depending on what the ratio was, it would be the other two that would go into their, if you like, their discipline structure, discipline in the sense of the language discipline structure, and then be bespoke to that. Now, again, coming back on cost effectiveness, that's much more effective. Now, personally, I would argue that you still should have the Spanish, the German, and the French teacher in the room for those times where you've got the three, let's say the three or the two languages together. But it wouldn't be unthinkable to think that that could happen. It would effectively take up less time in terms of timetabling space, but it would take up the same amount of time in terms of human space and human resources. Now, I don't think we want to give business managers too much possibility of limiting those human resources.
You indeed do need the specialism. You need the specialist knowledge, and especially at that, at A level, you do need specialist people to to be able to, for students to learn adequately. But that's an interesting, it's an interesting proposal, I think.
Okay. Well, look, let's close this down. We're effectively gonna stop the transmission here. We hope someone's found that useful. We don't even know whether it's gone out live in reality.
We're going to check now.
So we've been speaking, I think, for getting on for an hour. So let's see if that becomes an interesting resource for anyone. Anyone who's watching out there, probably no one, but anyone who's watching out there, thank you for putting up with our ramblings. Thank you for putting up with my creaking chair. And at one point, my tummy made a very loud noise. So, thanks. All the best.
Thank you.
We wish you the best. We're going to stop our transmission right now. Cheers.